In the early 80s, Japanese products were everywhere. Cars, the radio cassette players that were in those cars, TVs, VCRs, microwaves, calculators. Nothing seemed to escape the relentless push of Japanese business. And with all this success, these companies were awash with money from investors who wanted to cash in on the Japanese tech boom. Many people thought it was just a matter of time before Japan took over the home and business computer market with machines that were cheaper and better than anything the West could produce. But it didn't happen. North America and Europe saw off repeated waves of attack, and it was Western machines that were better and cheaper. Why was that? Why were microcomputers a bright spot when car companies had such a hard time competing? A big problem Japanese computers had in the early days was displaying text. Japanese text, that is, Western letters and numbers could fit on a keyboard with 40 or so keys. At the time, Japanese typewriters were massive things with thousands of kanji characters. How could each one be entered on a small keyboard, and how could computers with limited memory store all of those characters? Solving this problem certainly slowed down work on computers in Japan. But that didn't mean they couldn't quickly catch up. In 1978, Japan created their first word processor, the Toshiba JW10, using a Western keyboard. Each kanji character was represented by a series of Western characters. This unlocked the ability for Japanese computers to work in Japan using hardware and software similar to that found in the West. Finally, Japan could make an all-purpose worldwide computer. One of the first was a Sharp MZ80K, a Z80 machine with 6 kilobytes of RAM that retailed for about £500, about the same price as an 8 kilobyte Commodore PET. This was no coincidence. It was designed to compete with that very computer. This was the same trick Japanese companies had done for decades: produce a copy of a Western product, improve the quality, innovate, then dominate. It launched in 1978, but took until 1979 to be exported. Only to Europe, mind, Sharp couldn't sell their version of the Z80 CPU in the USA. Reviewers found it similar to the PET in both good and bad ways. It included a monochrome monitor and a cassette to load and save programs. It had similar PET-ski graphics. The BASIC was full-featured and actually ran faster than the PET. But there were missteps as well. BASIC had to be loaded from cassette every single time the computer was turned on, which made it seriously impractical. And it had a similar unfathomable keyboard that by now Commodore had replaced for something far more usable. It didn't fare well against the PET. It was more expensive, it had next to no software at launch compared to the growing software library for the established PET. For more software, Sharp pinned their hopes on CP/M compatibility, that ubiquitous operating system of the time that already had a lot of software written for it. Sharp were picky when it came to local dealers. They wanted highly skilled people to show the machine in its best light. As far as advertising went, very little work was done, with computer magazine adverts only every 3 to 4 months in 1979 and 1980. Much of the promotion was handed off to those local dealers. This at a time when US and UK computer makers were using double-page spreads and newspaper adverts to get the public mobilised behind their computer. Japan were doing even worse in the largest computer market, the USA. If anything, there was a British invasion coming, not a wave of Japanese computers.
Bought a home computer, huh?
An Atari 800 home computer. Nothing but the best for my son.
Part of this shutout was American and now European computer makers were actually designing excellent products, sometimes manufactured in Japan. People like Jack Tremay of Commodore saw Japan as a threat to the entire American electronics industry. He'd lost the calculator market in the 70s, and he was damned if he was going to let Commodore lose the home computer market. So computers like the 1980 VIC-20, which actually launched in Japan first, were designed to keep 1 or even 2 steps ahead of what Japan could deliver. And it worked. Japan had nothing to get even close. Some of you might mention the Video Genie, a 1980 computer that was really a clone of the Tandy TRS-80. It was actually not produced in Japan but in Hong Kong, but being based on a 3-year-old machine, it too suffered against newer competition. One area Japan were ahead though was pocket computers, again from Sharp. It was sold under the Sharp brand, but Sharp also made quick inroads into the Western computer market with rebrands, selling it through Radio Shack and Tandy dealers. Japan was the master of pocket calculators, and these were essentially calculators on steroids, so at first the West had nothing to compete. They would quickly be followed up by devices from Casio and Panasonic. There were other Japanese microcomputers at the time as well, like the 1979 NEC PC8000 series, but you wouldn't know it. Most Western adverts in 1979 and 1980 that refer to NEC are instead talking about NEC's printer. The PC8000 made it to North America and Europe in the summer of 1981, aided by NEC's printer dealer network. Toshiba also tossed their hat into the computer ring. As I mentioned, they'd produced a word processor in 1978 and presented an updated model in North America in 1981, along with the VSBC, or Very Small Business Computer, another CP/M model. Canon had the CX-1, but there was very little advertising to push it. One thing reviews consistently pointed out about Japanese computers, which they felt may come to dominate, was their quality. From case construction to keyboards, Japan had got the hardware right. But so far they weren't the cheap deal that, say, a Honda or a Toyota had been in the 1970s. Sharp was still selling the MZ80K in 1982, now with more native software. There had been follow-ups as well, the business-focused MZ80B in 1981 with extra features, and an update to the MZ80K, the MZ80A in 1982, both with a more sensible keyboard. But Sharp's computers didn't sell in anything like the quantity of competing systems. Other Japanese companies were producing business machines of their own as well. Casio tried to expand from watches and calculators with the FX9000P. Fujitsu sold the expensive FM8 with 640 by 200 resolution and 8 colours. But like others, there wasn't much advertising gusto behind any of these efforts. Sony had the SMC70, a computer with good graphics and which found a home supporting video production. It was also the first computer to use Sony's 3.5-inch disk standard that would go on to become the dominant floppy disk of the late 80s and 90s. But like other Japanese Z80 machines running CP/M, the SM70 again failed to get much traction. By 1982, NEC were actually one of the more mature Japanese computer companies. They were getting more aggressive about marketing their PC8000 business machine. They'd also introduced the APC, or Advanced Personal Computer. It used Intel's new 8086 chip to run CP/M. It also ran MS-DOS, but this was in the days before IBM PC clones, and the APC wasn't fully compatible. Epson, a division of Seiko, had been selling printers for years with a lot of success. By 1982, they held a commanding 75% market share thanks to machines like the mighty MX80. That meant it had distribution deals across Europe and North America that it could use to sell its computers. The first model, the QX10, was a formal business machine that, yes you guessed it, used a Z80 chip to run CP/M. Epson set out the system for the novice user, the person who'd never bought a computer before. You just turn it on and you can start word processing. Printing your documents, of course, with an Epson printer. Then there was their take on a portable computer, the HX20. Japan was a master of miniaturization, and Epson put a good-sized keyboard with a micro cassette recorder and an LCD screen and even a tiny printer for a full-featured computer in an A4 size package you could carry in one hand. With the built-in NiCad rechargeable batteries that during normal use lasted 50 hours, you could be doing work on the train, then sling your HX20 into your briefcase and head into the office. When you got there, you could plug in a monitor, a disk drive and a regular printer for a full day's work. Epson said that they were working on word processors and spreadsheet applications, and cartridges could be swapped in for the cassette module for instant loading of common software. This was a revolutionary product for 1982, Japan playing to its strengths. Could this notebook computer be the future of business? Well, not in this form. In 1981, IBM released their personal computer. It was a good business computer, solidly built from a well-respected brand, and sales exploded. IBM couldn't keep up with supply, which meant dealers only got a fraction of the machines that they'd asked for. And it was American companies, not Japanese, that were the first to realize there was a gap in the market for a computer that could run any PC application, to be fully compatible. And by the summer of 1982, the first of these was on the market. By the end of the year, Texas-based Compaq produced their first PC clone, and the rest was history. Most Japanese machines used a Z80 chip and ran the CP/M operating system that was quickly looking dated. Portables like the Epson HX20 didn't have the necessary software library. Pocket computers were more a curiosity rather than a big seller. They were a solution looking for a problem. So despite a really good start, the Japanese were wrong-footed, and it would take them time to react. All of their focus hadn't been on the consumer market, it had been on the business market. This was presumably where they saw the most profit. They'd largely ignored the consumer market, but by 1983 this was beginning to change. NEC stripped down the PC 8000 as the PC 6000 series, selling it for $349. America and Europe fretted this would quickly drop in price and Japanese companies would get their act together and flood the market with quality machines at bargain basement prices. After all, Japanese chip makers were already undercutting American companies on price, despite a 4% tariff. But all this fretting needn't have happened. 1983 was the year of the Texas Instruments Commodore price war. The $349 NEC PC 6000 looked positively expensive when the TI-99 and the VIC-20 could be had for less than $100. Japan had no chance of competing with that, and for now they focused on other product categories like microwave ovens. It didn't help that Japanese consumers didn't buy computers the same way that the West did. They didn't have a clear division between home and business computers. The business machines I've mentioned so far were actually used in Japanese homes. This meant American and European companies had a much better idea of what computer bedroom coders wanted. The NEC PC 6000 or the Tomy Tutor kids computer weren't going to hold a candle to a Commodore 64, a BBC Micro or a ZX Spectrum, at least as far as bang for the buck. These computers were cheaper, and as computer companies discovered, they sold on their ability to play fun games. This gap between what Japan was offering and what people wanted was clear when Toshiba subsidiary CPL launched the 4KB Sword M5 in 1983 with very little software for £190. By this time, the 3.5KB VIC-20 was £140 with a full travel keyboard, or get a 48KB ZX Spectrum for £130. There was no contest. So a reset was needed, with a new start and a new direction. Japan found it through an unlikely collaboration between the people who designed the QuickShot joystick and MS-DOS maker Microsoft. After making the QuickShot, American company Spectra Video had created their first computer, the SV318. They needed a version of BASIC and, like many computer makers, reached out to Microsoft, who were more than happy to oblige. Meanwhile, Panasonic were looking for that elusive new direction for their home computer strategy. They discovered the Spectra Video SV318 and liked what they saw, signing an agreement to turn the design, with a few tweaks, into a standard. The idea of a standard appealed to other Japanese companies as well. They also had a hard time competing with existing Western home computers and their mountain of software, but together, maybe. They'd seen the power of getting behind the VHS standard and saw the pain Sony were having trying to go it alone with Betamax. Maybe no surprise then, Sony was one of the first to sign up to this new standard that would be called MSX. Despite much of Microsoft's focus being on making PC clones a success, they saw the value in doing the MSX software work. They owned the standard operating system for PCs and were raking in money. This would allow them to do the same thing for home computers. The main MSX work was extending Microsoft Basic to support new graphics, sound and peripherals, but they also made MSX files MS-DOS compatible to allow easy exchange of what was rapidly becoming the world's most popular file format. Not many other home computers could make that claim. The MSX standard called for a Z80 chip, Japan's favourite. For graphics, the same Texas Instruments chip used for the TI-99/4 delivered up to 256 by 192 16-color graphics with support for sprites. There was also the highly competent 3-channel AY sound chip. Each computer used an MSX engine custom IC that reduced the chip count like the ULA had done for the Sinclair ZX81 and Spectrum. Expansion was to be the key with cartridge ports, extra RAM, disk interfaces and whatever else customers wanted to add. And being a Z80 computer, it could of course run CP/M, making it more flexible. Japanese companies saw the logic in banding together under a VHS-like standard. Many joined up. In fact, it would be almost easier to list Japanese companies that didn't sell an MSX computer. Peripherals such as disk drives were lined up using Sony's 3.5-inch disk drive, of course, and a good amount of work was done to prime software developers to provide a raft of software at launch. Computer journalists saw MSX as the future. They felt the home computer market badly needed standards. Retailers needed to stock Commodore 64 games, ZX Spectrum games, BBC games, and maybe several others. Over in the business world, retailers knew a PC word processor would work on any PC, and a spreadsheet or a document written on one PC could be passed to another department or another business and easily read on another PC. Now Japan had the standard. Where should MSX be launched? With the US price war making profits almost impossible, this market was mostly avoided. MSX would obviously be sold domestically and in developing markets where Western machines hadn't yet got a good hold. Europeans had to wait until the end of 1984 to experience the new MSX hotness, but when it arrived in force. By October, machines from Sony, Sanyo, Toshiba, JVC, Korean company Goldstar, now known as LG, and Canon were being touted in the UK with big splashy full-page adverts. Competitors dismissed the MSX standard as far too little, far too late, but they felt that eventually the Japanese could succeed, and maybe they too should start a standard of their own. European demand for MSX, though, was tepid and it didn't improve over time. But Japan stuck doggedly to making MSX work. They launched MSX2 in 1985 with better video modes. Up to 256 colours could be displayed on the screen for the first time.
Hello. Mike, I hear you got one of the new Commodore Amigas.
But by this point, the West was starting to embrace the next generation of home computers, the 16-bit Atari ST and Commodore Amiga. That was the new hotness, not slightly better 8-bit Japanese computers that looked out of date. But why was the MSX demand so tepid when it launched in 1983? Well, it was based on the Spectravideo SV318, which, to be fair, hadn't exactly flown off the shelves. Did Japanese companies feel that sales would improve with a Sony badge stuck on the front? Many people who had a computer in Europe already had one. If you wanted a new computer, best to get the same one your friends at school had, so you could borrow or maybe even copy their games for free. Relatively few people owned an MSX. And during the big MSX push in late 1983 and early 1984, there wasn't that much good software. Given MSX used a similar architecture to the ZX Spectrum, many early games were simply ports of games from that machine. It wasn't cheap either. In 1984, a Commodore 64 cost around £200. Most MSX machines were in the £280 price range, with only the Goldstar cheaper at £240. A ZX Spectrum could be had for only £130. Consumers needed a reason to pay the extra money. And with every manufacturer having to adhere to the same standard, they found it hard to differentiate, with journalists describing them as cookie-cutter home computers, hardly a glowing term. Each had the same 4 directional keys on the right and 5 function keys up top. With each machine almost identical, surely consumers would buy the cheapest, leading to a race to the bottom and lower profits. It would be argued that it was just too late. In fact, I've just done that. Consumers were mostly settled on Commodore and Sinclair products, so why switch? Many other pretenders fell by the wayside, like the Dragon 32 and the Memotech MTX, despite a lot of advertising. But the Amstrad CPC range sold much better than MSX across Europe and became a major contender in the 1980s, despite launching almost a year after MSX. What did Amstrad have which MSX didn't?
Wouldn't it be nice if your home computer was ready to use as soon as you got it home? Wouldn't it be marvellous if the manufacturers threw in £100 worth of software and if the computer had a built-in cassette data recorder?
Well, it helped the CPC sold as a complete package, including a monitor and a cassette recorder or a disk drive. Just plug it in and go. And Amstrad were laser focused on cutting costs to provide the maximum value. This meant that by the end of 1984 you could buy a CPC with a monitor and a cassette recorder for £240, when a Toshiba HX10 cost £280, without a cassette recorder or a screen. Underneath, both had very similar specs, 64 kilobytes, full travel keyboard and good sound. On this level, the CPC compared favourably not only to the MSX, but established machines as well, the Commodore 64 and the ZX Spectrum. Amstrad already had distribution deals with major UK electronics stores as they sold bargain basement audio products. I wouldn't call them hi-fis, they had pretty terrible sound. But for people with limited funds or who didn't care much about audio quality, they were a great choice. This success, along with a flair for advertising, meant the CPC found a loyal fan base across Europe. For MSX, the root of the problem was this. It was designed to solve a manufacturer problem. How could Panasonic, Sony, etc. break into the home computer market? Amstrad, on the other hand, looked at it from a completely different direction. They focused on what the customer wanted, and what the customer wanted was a whole bedroom coding gaming package for a low price. Now, I've been trashing MSX quite a bit during the last bit of the video. Yes, it didn't sell well in Europe, but it sold very well in domestic markets, Japan and South Korea, and markets that were relatively new to home computers, Brazil, Argentina and the Middle East. Numbers vary, but it's generally agreed that at least 3 million MSX computers were sold in Japan, so it might have sold poorly worldwide, but in the Japanese market, where there were few home computers localized to the Japanese language, it sold very well. Throughout the birth of the microcomputer, Japan always seemed to make the wrong move. They turned up late, partly because of their character system. They focused on technology that always seemed a couple of years out of date, like a Commodore PET clone. They backed CP/M to get an install base of software when the world was falling out of love with CP/M. It didn't help that in the early days they were very light on marketing, which meant customers weren't going into dealerships and asking about Japanese computers. They backed new computer designs like the Epson HX20 and pocket computers that didn't sell in large numbers. When PC clones arrived, it was game over in the business space. Realistically, they didn't offer a home computer until 1983 with the Sword M5. They backed MSX machines, which cost too much in the USA, so they didn't even try to sell them there. And in Europe, as those competitors said, they were too little, too late. Unlike other industries like cars and hi-fi, Japan just couldn't get a handle on what computer customers wanted. It wasn't Japan that thought up the VIC-20 or the ZX81. This was a quickly changing market and they just couldn't keep up. Those other industries, cars and hi-fi, had relatively established companies in the West, and some of them were making major mistakes. Take British Leyland or Ford or GM in the 70s in the USA, who didn't create the small fuel-efficient world cars that consumers wanted. The computer market was completely different. The best and brightest in the West didn't want to join Chrysler or Vauxhall in the late 70s, They wanted to join a computer startup. These computer makers were new and hungry, with young people working stupidly long hours. Western computer companies were lean, efficient, and could change directions incredibly quickly. So Japan lost. But didn't Japan actually win? What printer were you connecting to your computer? It was more than likely Japanese. The same for the floppy disk drive, or half the chips in the computer, or the monitor, or the keyboard. And many of those Western computers were being manufactured in Japan. The computer might be designed in Cupertino by Apple, but most of the money generated from the computer was being sent back to the land of the rising sun. As the late 80s rolled around, Japan was still soaring away at making MSX a going concern. The market was moving to 16-bit home computers, but the market was also subtly changing as well. Kids weren't hankering for a home computer in their bedrooms, but a games console. And in that race, Japan was doing a lot better. Nintendo released the Famicom in 1983, the same year MSX launched. They sold it as the Nintendo Entertainment System in the West in 1985 with a back catalogue of successful games, and it was an almost instant hit. Japan was a pioneer in ultra-compact design, and so Nintendo then cornered the handheld console market with the Game Boy in 1989. On the surface, Japan lost the battle, but with games consoles and the underlying hardware, Japan won. Now, if you remember, in the last video I talked about the Sinclair ZX Spectrum. Before this, even before the ZX80, this computer behind me here, Clive Sinclair had been a part of another computer project. That would eventually arrive very late in 1982, the Grundy New Brain. Why was it so late, and why did it flop? We'll find out in the next video. Why did almost all home computers use the basic programming language in the 1980s? The answer is in the video on the right. And once the New Brain video is ready, that'll also be on the right. Thanks for watching to the end, and I'll see you in the next video.